The first thing my wife did when she signed the divorce papers was laugh. And the worst part was not the sound, it was how comfortable she looked making it. My name is David Harper, 46 years old, born and raised just outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of man who measures a good day by clean hands at dinner, bills paid on time, and a roof that does not leak when the spring storms roll in. I was sitting at the end of a long oak table in a county courthouse conference room, my wedding band already in my pocket, watching Sophia Harper drag her pen across the last page like she was autographing a victory. The fluorescent lights above us hummed with that cold, government building buzz, and the air smelled faintly of coffee, printer toner, and old paper. Her attorney sat beside her with a leather folder opened flat, smiling like the whole thing had been handled before lunch. Sophia leaned back, crossed one leg over the other, and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "I hope you kept something for yourself, David." Then she laughed again. Soft, polished, cruel. I did not answer. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my hand on the table or give her the satisfaction of watching me flinch. I just looked at the black ink drying beneath her name and felt 18 years of marriage narrow into one thin line on a legal document. There is a special kind of silence that settles over a man when he realizes the person he protected has mistaken his patience for weakness. Mine settled right there, between the pitcher of water and the stack of financial disclosures her side. Thought told the whole story. Sophia wore a cream blazer, pearl earrings, and the same perfume she used to save for anniversary dinners. To anyone else, she looked graceful. To me, she looked like a stranger wearing memories that no longer belonged to her. 2 seats away, my attorney, Grace Whitman, kept her face calm, one finger resting on a sealed folder no one else had asked about yet. That folder had been on the table for 20 minutes, plain manila, no label, no drama, no warning. Sophia had glanced at it once and dismissed it, the way she had dismissed my late nights, my quiet meetings, my old pickup truck, and every sacrifice that did not come wrapped in a designer box. Across from us, the court clerk adjusted her glasses and gathered the signed pages. Outside the narrow window, downtown traffic moved under a gray morning sky, headlights sliding over wet pavement from an overnight rain. Everything looked ordinary. That almost made it worse. Your life can split open in a room where nobody is shouting. It can happen while a clock ticks above a door and a judge checks his notes behind a polished bench. Sophia thought this was the end of me. She thought the house, the accounts, the lake property, and the company shares she had circled in red were the final pieces on the board. She thought I had spent 20 years building something she could simply smile at, sign for, and walk away with. What she did not know was that I had learned a long time ago never to confuse what a man owns with what a man controls. When the judge entered, everyone stood. Sophia's smile stayed in place. Mine never appeared. I only buttoned my jacket, felt the weight of my empty ring finger, and waited for the moment her laughter would have nowhere left to hide. David Harper sat back in his chair, hands folded neatly on the polished surface of the oak table, eyes fixed on the plain manila folder that seemed insignificant to everyone else, but carried the weight of years of planning. The room smelled faintly of brewed coffee and old leather, the hum of the fluorescent lights above creating a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. He had watched Sophia Harper for weeks, waiting for her to reveal her confidence, and now here she was, smug, assured, convinced that every asset she circled, every figure she calculated, was hers to claim. But she did not understand the patience that came from decades of hard work, from knowing when to speak and when to remain unseen. Grace Whitman, his attorney, shifted slightly, her expression unchanged, but David felt the energy in the room tighten, a taut line between what Sophia expected and what was about to unfold. He recalled the early mornings when he drove from his small office to the factory, hands raw from hours of handling materials, balancing budgets while others took their coffee breaks. Those years had taught him to measure every word, every glance, every silence. Now, silence was his greatest weapon. Sophia glanced at him briefly, a flicker of curiosity in her eye that vanished as quickly as it came. She thought he was simply enduring, that he had no leverage left, but David knew better. Every bank statement, every contract, every trust agreement, quietly arranged, was a piece in a puzzle she had never seen. The judge took his seat, nodding at the attorneys to begin, and the room collectively exhaled, the tension hanging like a heavy curtain. David did not move. He allowed Sophia to settle into her comfortable rhythm, allowed the small smirk to remain on her lips, because he understood that the bigger the confidence, the sharper the fall. As the clerk shuffled papers and the murmurs in the courtroom faded, David let his mind drift briefly to the past, remembering the hours spent negotiating contracts, the long nights at the office, the quiet victories that were invisible to the world but built the foundation of his life. Each memory reinforced the calm that settled over him now. He did not speak. He did not fidget. He simply waited, a composed observer in a room full of assumptions. Sophia continued to smile, believing that the countdown to her triumph was ticking with each passing second. She was unaware of the depth of preparation behind the unassuming folder, unaware of the strategic positioning that would soon turn expectation into shock. David Harper had learned that power often hides in plain sight, that patience amplifies impact, and that true control comes from understanding the timing of revelation. The judge cleared his throat, and the room shifted in anticipation, the faint tapping of a pen echoing against the polished wood. Everyone focused on the impending announcements, the reading of figures and declarations, but David Harper remained a pillar of calm, a man whose silence was louder than any protest, whose restraint carried the promise of a calculated turn. In that moment, as the world seemed to pause around him, the subtle movements of the judge's hand toward the folder signaled the beginning of a revelation that would upend expectations, and David Harper, steady and unyielding, allowed the tension to reach its peak, letting every eye, every thought, every assumption in the room hang suspended in anticipation of what was to come. The judge lifted his glasses, adjusting the frame just slightly before glancing down at the documents in front of him, and the room held its collective breath. David Harper remained perfectly still, hands lightly resting on the table, eyes calm but attentive, as if measuring every second. Sophia Harper shifted slightly, the faintest flicker of unease crossing her features, though her posture remained composed. The judge began to speak, his voice steady, measured, almost ceremonial, detailing assets, property, trusts, and accounts in a sequence that would have sounded ordinary to anyone unfamiliar with the careful orchestration behind the numbers. David listened with a quiet satisfaction, aware of how years of careful planning had positioned him to reveal control without confrontation. He remembered the evenings spent reviewing each statement, confirming ownership, understanding exactly how every property, every investment, every business interest could be leveraged if the situation required. This was that moment, the culmination of subtle strategy and patience. Sophia followed along, her expression shifting imperceptibly as the magnitude of the information started to register. She had believed the court would validate her expectations, that her confidence would be rewarded immediately. Instead, the narrative of control was turning quietly, inexorably, in David's favor. The judge enumerated a sequence of holdings, beginning with accounts Sophia had assumed were under her influence, then moving through properties purchased decades prior with quiet diligence, trust funds that she had overlooked, and finally business ventures that, though outwardly shared, were structured in a way she had not anticipated. Each revelation landed softly at first, then gained weight, each pause allowing the impact to resonate. David Harper did not speak, he did not react. He simply observed the shift, watching as the composure Sophia had relied on began to waver. Her eyes flicked toward him once, seeking a reassurance that had never been offered, only to find calm resolve. Grace Whitman, seated just to his side, allowed her gaze to remain neutral, letting the mechanics of the moment unfold without intervention. The air in the room seemed to tighten, the hum of the lights and the faint rustling of papers punctuating the slow drip of realization. Every figure, every property, every trust was another note in the quiet symphony of revelation David had composed over years. He recalled the mornings spent calculating, negotiating, and documenting, the small victories no one noticed, each one a seed that now bore the fruit of clarity and authority. Sophia's lips parted slightly, her confident mask beginning to falter as the structure she had relied upon crumbled imperceptibly. The judge's voice remained steady, factual, devoid of flourish, allowing the information itself to carry the weight. David Harper did not need to say a word. His preparation, his restraint, and his patience spoke volumes more than any declaration could. In that room, between the polished wood of the conference table and the subtle reflections of the overhead lights, the balance of power shifted, silently but irrevocably, and David's quiet presence anchored the impact, letting the truth reveal itself in its full measure while maintaining the calm, controlled composure that had guided him to this moment. David Harper felt the room shift almost imperceptibly as the judge continued to outline the structured assets, detailing the specific arrangements of trusts and business interests that Sophia had assumed were straightforward. The air seemed thicker, almost vibrating with tension as each carefully documented number and property listing was read aloud. Sophia Harper's confident mask began to show tiny cracks, a micro-expression here, a slight falter of posture there, all unnoticed by anyone not attuned to the subtleties of human behavior. David kept his hands on the table, fingers loosely interlaced, breathing steady, allowing the silence between each revelation to amplify the weight of what was being disclosed. He thought back to the nights in his office, surrounded by ledgers and spreadsheets, the soft hum of the printer and the distant city sounds filtering through the window, moments when he had organized each account with meticulous precision, knowing that one day this quiet preparation might become his strongest advantage. He did not rush to revel in the discomfort that was slowly settling over Sophia. There was no need for it. Every pause, every careful enunciation by the judge, was a note in the crescendo of impact. The clerk shuffled papers again, and the faint click of a pen echoed through the room, a metronome keeping time with the quiet realization that Sophia's assumptions were unraveling. David's mind traced back through years of disciplined work, long hours negotiating deals, ensuring that every signature, every account, every property title was arranged to protect not only what he had built, but also the integrity of his life. He remembered the early mornings walking through construction sites, the scent of fresh-cut timber and concrete mingling in the air, the sound of heavy machinery as he made decisions quietly but decisively. That same quiet decisiveness now radiated from him as he observed the gradual change in Sophia's demeanor. She adjusted her blazer, crossed her arms, and for the first time, looked uncertain, glancing at her attorney with an expression that suggested, though faintly, a realization that control was slipping from her hands. David's lips did not move, his posture did not shift, yet every inch of him radiated confidence built on preparation and patience. Grace Whitman gave him a subtle nod, acknowledging the strategy unfolding without uttering a single word. The judge paused, allowing the significance of the numbers, the structure of the assets, and the thoughtful arrangement of the trusts to sink in. Sophia's eyes met David's briefly, searching for a reaction, a crack, a gesture of human weakness to exploit, but she found none. In that gaze, she saw only calm, unshakable resolve, a quiet power that had been quietly growing over years, unobserved, yet now undeniable. David Harper let the room breathe in that tension, knowing that every detail had been accounted for, every contingency considered, and that the balance of perception was now tilting irrevocably. The shift was subtle but absolute. Control had passed, quietly, deliberately, and without spectacle, leaving only the impact of preparation, patience, and strategic silence to speak louder than any words ever could. The judge turned another page, and David Harper knew they were entering the part Sophia had never bothered to understand. It was not the obvious wealth that mattered. It was not the lake property with the glass walls, or the downtown office building with his name discreetly listed on the directory, or the investment accounts her attorney had circled like prizes on a treasure map. It was the structure underneath it all, the quiet architecture of ownership built long before their marriage began to fracture. David remembered the first time an old mentor named Charles Beckett told him that money without protection was just weather waiting to change. Charles had been 72 then, a retired tax attorney with silver hair, worn leather shoes, and the kind of eyes that made young men sit up straighter. David had been 31, proud of his first major profit, naive enough to think honesty alone could protect what he built. Charles had tapped one finger on a legal pad and said, "Build clean, document everything, and never let emotion sign what logic should review." David did not know it then, but those words would become a fence around his future. Over the years, he had placed premarital assets where they belonged, separated inherited interests from marital accounts, documented contributions with the discipline of a man who knew memory could not testify in court. He paid taxes properly. He signed agreements properly. He kept records properly. It was not flashy. It was not something Sophia would brag about at charity luncheons or country club dinners. But it was real. The judge's voice moved through the room, calm and exact, identifying the Harper family holdings trust, the pre-existing ownership documents, the restricted shares in the manufacturing company, and the terms that kept certain assets outside the marital estate. Sophia's attorney leaned forward, his expression tightening for the first time all morning. Sophia looked at him, then at the judge, then back at David, as if the room had suddenly changed languages without warning. David felt no rush of triumph. What he felt was colder and cleaner than that. Relief. For years, Sophia had treated his restraint like ignorance. She saw the old pickup truck and thought small. She saw the plain suits and thought tired. She saw his quiet dinners, his early mornings, his refusal to chase applause, and thought there was nothing left beneath the surface. But David had never lived for appearances. He had lived for foundations. The judge continued, noting that several assets Sophia claimed had never been directly owned by David in the way her filing suggested. Some were controlled through entities established before the marriage. Some belonged to a trust created with his late father's estate. Some were tied to business partners through operating agreements that limited personal division. Each sentence landed like a door closing softly. Not slammed, just final. Sophia's hand moved toward her water glass, then stopped halfway. Her smile was gone now, replaced by something thinner, uncertain, almost fragile. David watched her carefully, not because he wanted her to suffer, but because he wanted to remember the exact moment performance met reality. Grace Whitman slid one document forward when the judge requested clarification, and the courtroom fell into the kind of silence that makes paper sound heavy. David looked down at his empty ring finger and understood something simple. He had not hidden his life from Sophia. He had protected it from the version of her that finally showed up to claim it. The document Grace Whitman slid forward was only 9 pages long, but the way Sophia stared at it, you would have thought it weighed 1,000 pounds. David Harper watched the clerk carry it to the judge, watched the judge read the first page, then the second, and felt the room tighten around the silence. It was the operating agreement for Harper Precision Components, signed 14 years earlier, amended twice, witnessed properly, filed properly, boring in the way only powerful paperwork can be boring. Sophia had always hated that company, not openly at first. In the beginning, she called it David's little machine shop, the place that smelled like metal dust and coolant, the place that kept him away during late shifts and emergency orders. Later, when the contracts grew and the factory expanded to 42,000 square feet outside Dayton, she started calling it Our Future. That was the first time David heard the change. Not his work, not his risk. Our future. He had not corrected her then. Marriage makes a man generous with language. He thought sharing pride meant sharing love. But paperwork does not care about pride. It cares about dates, signatures, capital contributions, and ownership restrictions written before anyone is angry enough to test them. The judge looked up and asked Sophia's attorney whether he had reviewed Section 7. The attorney cleared his throat, flipped through his copy, and for one quiet second, his face gave him away. Section 7 was the lock. It stated that David's membership interest in the company had been purchased with premarital funds, protected from transfer, and subject to a binding buy-sell provision that prevented any spouse, creditor, or outside claimant from receiving direct control or valuation based on projected growth. Plain language, quiet language, the kind of language that waits years to matter. Sophia leaned toward her attorney and whispered something David could not hear. He saw the attorney shake his head once, very slightly. That small motion changed the temperature of the room. Sophia's fingers tightened around the stem of her water glass. Grace folded her hands again, calm as a church pew. David's mind drifted, not to the courtroom, but to a winter morning 12 years earlier when he stood inside the first factory bay wearing a canvas coat and work gloves, watching steam rise from a paper cup of coffee. The heat had failed that week. Payroll was due Friday. A shipment was late. One bad month could have buried him. Sophia had been home planning a kitchen remodel from a magazine spread. David had slept 3 hours a night, called vendors before sunrise, and convinced a bank manager in a gray suit to extend a line of credit by showing him purchase orders and a handwritten plan. Nobody clapped. Nobody saw the panic he swallowed. Nobody saw him sit in his truck at midnight and whisper, "Keep going." Now the judge was reading the result of all those quiet decisions, and Sophia was hearing, maybe for the first time, that she had mistaken proximity for ownership. The company she wanted to divide like furniture had roots deeper than her claims. The wealth she thought was loose cash had walls around it. The man she laughed at had not been empty-handed. He had simply been waiting for the truth to be read by someone she could not interrupt. The judge set the operating agreement down and reached for the next document. And Sophia Harper finally stopped pretending she understood where the ground was. David saw it in the way her shoulders drew inward. Not much, just enough to make the cream blazer look less like armor and more like fabric. Her attorney asked for a moment to review the amended filings, but his voice had lost its shine. It had the careful tone of a man trying to walk across ice after hearing it crack. Grace Whitman did not object. She did not need to. The facts were already in the room, sitting under the fluorescent lights, organized, signed, dated, and impossible to charm. David breathed in slowly through his nose, catching the dry scent of paper and coffee, and for the first time that morning, he allowed himself to look directly at Sophia without the filter of memory. He did not see the woman in the blue sundress from their first lake weekend. He did not see the woman who once stood barefoot in their first kitchen, laughing because they could only afford mismatched plates and a $6 bottle of grocery store wine. He saw the woman who had sat across from him at breakfast 3 months ago and said, "You would be surprised what I am entitled to," as if marriage had been an investment account waiting for liquidation. Back then, he had only nodded and buttered his toast. She thought that nod meant defeat. It had meant inventory. From that morning forward, David had gathered what Grace asked for: purchase records, tax returns, trust documents, partnership agreements, bank trails, business valuations, and old emails that clarified intent without emotion. He had placed each piece into order like lining up tools on a workbench. No shouting, no accusations, no midnight arguments that could be twisted into theater. Just evidence. The judge now reviewed the valuation report prepared by the court-appointed expert, and that was when the second shift came. Sophia had expected a huge number attached to David's personal name, something easy to divide, easy to wave in his face, easy to convert into a fresh start paid for by the years she had mocked. Instead, the report described layers: protected business interests, restricted equity, irrevocable trust assets, separate property traced to inheritance, and income streams governed by agreements she had never read because she thought understanding was beneath her. Her lips moved slightly, as if counting invisible losses. David looked at the table, at the faint scratches in the oak, and remembered a different table from years before. A folding card table in his first rented warehouse, where he ate cold turkey sandwiches at 10 at night while reviewing invoices with a calculator that stuck on the number 8. Sophia had called then, asking why he was still working. He had said, "Because one day this will matter." She had sighed and told him not to be dramatic. The memory passed through him without bitterness now. It felt like watching weather from inside a strong house. The judge cleared his throat and read the central finding in a voice so neutral it made the words even heavier. David's declared personal marital estate was far smaller than Sophia's filing alleged, but his controlled net worth, through protected entities and trusts, exceeded $180 million. The room went silent in a way David would remember for the rest of his life. Sophia turned pale, not because he had nothing, but because he had everything she thought she could take, and almost none of it was waiting for her hands. The number stayed in the air long after the judge finished reading it, like a church bell no one expected to hear. $180 million. Not shouted, not celebrated, just spoken into a quiet Ohio courtroom with the same tone a man might use to read a street address. That made it worse for Sophia. There was no drama for her to fight against, no arrogance for her to accuse, no performance for her to interrupt. There was only the clean, steady weight of truth. David Harper watched her fingers loosen around the water glass. The rim tapped once against the table, a small sound, almost nothing, but it carried through the room like a signal. Her attorney leaned close and spoke in a low voice, but Sophia did not seem to hear him. Her eyes were fixed on David now, wide and searching, as if the man sitting across from her had been replaced by someone she should have recognized years earlier. David knew that look. It was the look people get when the story they told themselves collapses under the facts. For years, Sophia had told herself he was practical but limited, successful but manageable, wealthy enough to benefit from but not powerful enough to fear losing. She had mistaken his modest habits for smallness. The 12-year-old pickup he still drove on weekends. The plain black coffee he preferred over expensive lattes. The navy suits he bought off the rack and had tailored instead of chasing labels. The habit of fixing a loose cabinet hinge himself, even though he could have hired someone for $100. She saw those things and built a version of him that made her feel superior. Now the judge had read a different version aloud, and that version came with signatures, filings, valuation reports, and legal walls she could not smile her way through. Sophia finally whispered, "David," and his name sounded different in her mouth. Softer, smaller, almost careful. He turned his eyes toward her, but he did not answer. Not because he wanted to punish her. Because some doors, once closed properly, do not need to be reopened just because someone knocks too late. The judge continued with the proposed division of marital property, and the practical terms landed one by one. The primary residence would be sold unless Sophia chose to buy out her share under the documented valuation. The lake property, traced to trust ownership, was excluded. Certain accounts were divided according to contributions. Her claim against Harper Precision Components was denied as filed. Temporary support would be reviewed based on actual marital income, not the inflated fantasy her petition had painted. Each item took something from her face. Not beauty, not pride exactly. Certainty. That was what disappeared. The certainty that life would bend because she expected it to. David felt the ache of it, because a part of him still remembered loving her before entitlement had hardened her voice. He remembered the woman who cheered when his first major contract cleared, the woman who once tucked a note inside his lunch bag that said, "I believe in you." He wondered when belief had turned into calculation. He wondered when love had started keeping score. But wondering was not the same as returning. Grace touched his sleeve lightly, a quiet reminder that the hearing was still moving. David nodded once. Across the table, Sophia's laugh from earlier felt like something from another life. Thin and foolish, swallowed by the room that now knew what she had not. The hearing ended not with a crash, not with shouting, not with the kind of dramatic moment Sophia Harper had probably imagined when she first decided David was an easy man to corner. It ended with papers being gathered, chairs sliding softly against the floor, and a judge reminding both sides of the next procedural steps in a voice that made everything feel final. David stood slowly, buttoning his jacket with hands that did not tremble. Grace Whitman placed the manila folder back into her briefcase, the same folder Sophia had ignored when the morning began, the same folder that had carried more truth than all of Sophia's confidence combined. Across the table, Sophia remained seated for a moment too long. Her attorney whispered to her again, but she only stared at the empty space in front of her, as if the numbers were still floating there, rearranging the last 18 years. When she finally looked up, her eyes found David's. There was no laughter now, no polished smirk, no little performance designed to make him feel small. Just a quiet, stunned awareness that the man she had underestimated had never been weak. He had been disciplined. There is a difference, and that difference had just been read into the record. In the hallway outside the courtroom, the old building smelled like floor wax and rain-soaked coats. People passed with folders tucked under their arms, each carrying some private disaster or private victory, and David felt strangely invisible among them. Sophia stepped out behind him, her heels softer now, less certain against the tile. "David," she said, and for a second, the sound pulled him backward. Back to first dates, first apartments, cheap dinners, nervous dreams, and the version of them that had once felt honest. He stopped, but he did not turn all the way around. She swallowed, choosing words with a care she should have used years earlier. "I did not know." David looked at the courthouse doors, at the gray daylight beyond the glass, at the wet sidewalk shining under an Ohio sky. Then he said, "That was the problem, Sophia. You stopped wanting to know me. You only wanted to count me." Her face tightened, not with anger this time, but with the kind of regret that arrives too late to be useful. David did not say more. Some endings deserve peace, not speeches. He walked through the doors and into the cool air, feeling the wind move across his empty ring finger. His truck waited at the curb, plain, reliable, covered in a thin layer of road dust. For the first time in months, he smiled, not because she had lost, but because he had not lost himself trying to prove his worth to someone determined not to see it. That was the lesson he carried with him as he drove away from the courthouse. Real strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is a document saved in the right drawer, a boundary held without apology, a man staying calm while the truth takes the stand for him. And maybe that is the part worth asking yourself after hearing this story. If someone laughed while trying to take everything you built, would you answer with anger, or would you let preparation speak for you? If stories like David Harper's make you think about loyalty, dignity, and the quiet power of knowing your own value, stay with this channel, because some truths only reveal themselves when the room gets silent.